Thank you very much for such a kind introduction. Welcome to the English Department Talk Series, and this is on interpreting studies from the Nuremberg Trials to Thammasat classrooms. And most of my students could not make it here today, so we already had this session an hour ago. So to make it even more relevant, we have the translation of this talk already in Thai. You can just go to this QR code, and there are different versions of it provided by our students. Okay. So I would like to start this talk today a bit differently. Usually when you write an essay, you would start with an introduction to spice things up, and then a body to get to the gist of it, and then a conclusion to wrap it up. Well, today I would like to do things a little differently. I would like to start with a conclusion, because I want to make this as a commitment to myself, and also if you happen to have suggestions after the session, please do give them to me, and maybe we could have the same conclusion or the second conclusion. And the conclusion is, I hope to start writing either a practice/theory book for our interpreting courses, either for consecutive interpreting or simultaneous interpreting. So we finally have some sort of text to cling on. Thank you very much, and this is when you're supposed to give me a round of applause, and then we go different ways. Okay. So now the real introduction. I would like to talk about a country called Romania. Apart from getting scammed by taxi drivers of Transylvania several times, riding on a van with no seat, and being stared at not because of my good-looking appearance, but because of a difference in my appearance. Well, I am not a Caucasian, obviously. I am Asian, and I was stared at many times. Romania, it's a country in Eastern Europe. The flight was about 9 to 10 hours from Bangkok to Vienna, Austria. Then another 2 or so to Bucharest, the capital city, where remnants of communism can still be seen and felt. Then another 3 to 3.5 hours from the city, the Bucharest is the capital city, to the city called Brașov, which is a very nice city, famous for the phrase Brașov, meaning, well, it sounds sort of like rhymes with taking your bra off. So the tradition would be girls would take their bra off. Just to confirm, I did not participate. Okay. So this is the conference I attended. It is called SUM Structure, Use, Meaning, 4th Conference on Theoretical and Applied Linguistics, Re- and Decontextualization at the Faculty of Letters, Transylvania University of Brașov in Romania. So interpreting. Now, I use the term interpreting so that we don't get ourselves confused with interpretation, which is often associated with textual analyses. Interpreting started from ancient Egypt to the Lewis and Clark expeditions with Sacagawea of the 19th century to the advent of interpreting apparatus that made simultaneous interpreting possible. Now, has anyone seen this movie before? This one. Can you tell us a little bit about this movie?
If you. This lady, she was she had some kind of past. She was in a relationship with maybe the leader of an insurgent group somewhere in Africa, and later on she became an interpreter or worked at the UN in New York, and came across her lover's ex-enemy, and
Excellent.
They were hunting her down or something. I don't quite remember. Something like that.
Thank you very much. Very accurate, actually. So what many of us call the UN interpreting could very well be influenced by the 2005 Hollywood blockbuster, The Interpreter, starring Nicole Kidman and Sean Penn. And no, most interpreters do not look like her. IMDb's synopsis goes like this. Political intrigue and deception unfold inside the United Nations, where a U.S. Secret Service agent is assigned to investigate an interpreter who overhears an assassination plot. Well, I think this point will relate to why interpreting research isn't yet prevalent, which I'll discuss later. Going back to 1945, our history recognizes the first time humankind saw simultaneous interpreting, making its first vast public appearance. This is in 1945 at the Nuremberg Trials, and Germany just lost the war. IMT, the International Military Tribunal, or IMT, organized the most famous trial of the Nazi leaders. The judges and prosecutors were from the four wartime allies: France, the USSR, well, the Soviet back then, and then we have the United Kingdom and the United States. So we have here German, which is the language of the defenders, US, Britain, using English, the French using French, and then we have the Soviet Union using Russian as the prosecution team. In order to execute execute them, pun intended, you would need something that is quick and perhaps simultaneous. And the other 12 trials were follow-up trials consisting of lower-ranking Nazis, and these trials were run solely by Americans. According to Siegfried Rambler, a German English former interpreter who was just 22 back then during the trials, he explained to the United States courts in 2010 that back then even videotapes had not been invented yet. So everything was recorded through wires. Now, the 20th century, much of the interest have been paid mainly towards high-level international settings. Fast forward to 2016, Thammasat University teaches a few courses of interpreting, and this is actually my first semester teaching it. Now, the practical side of the field seems to have been nurtured quite well, at least at TU. What about in terms of research that have been conducted on the field? Catalina, who teaches at the University of Alicante in Spain, I met her during the conference in Romania. She is an interpreter. She works from Romanian into Spanish, vice versa. Usually she works for the Spanish royal family. She said that in her session at the conference, interpreting the King's speech neglected facet that experimental research is still scarce, either because professionals are reluctant to be analyzed by an external observer or because many settings are strictly confidential. Well, this is a relatively young field. How young would you like to guess? Not my young, but 30 years? Any other alternatives here? 40? Okay, thank you. So, we'll talk about the first definitive work on the field, and we cannot talk about the evolution of interpreting research without talking about a researcher named Franz Pochhacker. This is him. Pochhacker is an associate professor of interpreting studies at the Center for Translation Studies at the University of Vienna. The definition of interpreting, according to him, is a translational activity, which is a special form of translation that is distinguished by its temporal immediacy. The categorization of interpreting was prescribed based on the social context of interaction or the setting in which interpreting occurs, be it court interpreting, interpreting in asylum proceedings, community interpreting, in mental health care, for the mass media, interpreting in conflict zones. In terms of modality, I think this is what you're more familiar with. It can be spoken or signed, visual, consecutive, or simultaneous. These two are the most famous, at least for now. Directionality and use of technology. Well, the first research study that broke the ground dates back to 1930. It was an interview-based survey, but this was leaning toward the cognitive qualities of how a human brain works. So it wasn't clearly an interpreting focused research, but it was sort of like a bridge between interpreting / psychology. 1965. Treisman explored lag times in simultaneous repetition or shadowing. Shadowing, if you're not familiar with that term, shadowing is when you imitate simultaneously the speech being given by the speaker, and you would try to catch up with the speech. And then so he looked at lag times between shadowing and simultaneous translation. It was found that there were longer response times for the latter. 1969, an experimental research was conducted by Barik in the very first doctoral thesis in the entire world, so 1969, on simultaneous interpreting. Barik studied 3 pairs of subjects with different levels of training. These subjects were English and French bilinguals. He used 4 different types of source, and it was found that interpreters crammed as much of their output as they could into pauses in the original message, so as to avoid simultaneous speaking and listening. 1977, British psychologist David Gerver conducted experimental studies having interpreters as his subjects. He looked at key concerns such as high input, speed, sound quality, and so on. But the milestone was the co-organized first international conference on interpreting held in Venice in 1977. So we could say that this is a relatively young field. Coming back to Thailand, how far have we come since then? In the last 50 years, the apparatus went from wire to state-of-the-art equipment. However, as the profession mainly requires acquired skills, we have decided to look away from research of the field. Have you seen this paper before? This is called the NDA, or Non-Disclosure Agreement. Well, this is, I think, one of the main factors preventing research in interpreting from being conducted. And every time, well, at least most of the time, I think, if an interpreter signs up for a job, he or she would be required to sign this agreement. And this agreement would limit the freedom of speech regarding the job. Okay? So what are the possibilities? Looking at the Nuremberg Trials, for example, it has already been 60 years, and the testimony that we have, it's a fading memory of a once 22-year-old interpreter. If I were asked today by a research geek, hey, could I record your interpreting session? Well, knowing in the back of my mind that every selected word would be thoroughly examined, perhaps the answer would be no. Now, what are the possibilities? I will probably stop talking for a little while, and I'd like to ask if you have any suggestions. If you're teaching or not teaching interpreting at the moment, we all are, Thailand is quite new. As far as I know, there's no one person who holds a PhD in interpreting studies in Thailand. So it's not even one person. So it's we're all quite new, and this session I am here to share, but also to take back your opinions and suggestions so that I can possibly start and initiate some sort of research even. Okay. Any suggestions?
So there's places that you go to do your PhD.
There are places.
Are they quite a number of places or very?
Well, most places would require you to know one of the UN languages. So mostly French, German, Spanish, or Italian. But there are exceptions that you may have to talk to the person in charge directly, that this is what I have at the moment, and would it be possible to continue my studies with this? Yeah. But there are places. Mainly the Asian languages that are there are Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, and that's about all. Yeah.
What about, this is very much out of ignorance. So for example, I'm just thinking about the possibility of getting some sort of data to do or to conduct your studies or something along that line. Whenever there's a UN assembly, for example, and of course there's interpreters doing their jobs. I suppose those scripts will be later published.
Yes, but the problem is the UN conferences are conducted in UN languages, which is not include Thai, so that would not be so relevant in our case.
I mean, in terms of getting sort of the data, because some of us lecturers probably know English, French, or German.
There is a channel, a website, or a channel. It's called the UN channel, and they publish all UN meetings. You get videos, and sometimes you get the transcripts also. So that's a pretty big source of information, but I don't know. It depends on how you design your research. Also, I don't know how useful that information will be. I mean, I use it in my classes, but since these are UN languages, it would take a lot of imagination to think of what to do with these things.
So I had the same thought, and so I spent about 2 hours talking to Catalina. You saw her before. And she said, hey, but you have students. But she did not give me the definite answer on the difficulty on languages, my working languages. Okay. So we have students. Could it be didactic research? Okay, students seem to be the apparent choice if one wishes to conduct a study, because the process is simple with useful outcome, at least for the students themselves. Now I'd like to share what we're doing with our classes, and this is EG 458 consecutive interpreting. And this is one of our students wearing a VR goggle. In this lesson, we talked about how each person interprets meanings differently, and the VR goggle would allow the person wearing it to see, to be in another reality. And in this session, I believe we played a video, The Starry Night, and he was asked to speak and describe everything he saw simultaneously, and the rule is you cannot stop talking. You just have to keep describing what you see. But that's one of the activities that we do. And this is the moment when Trump trumped. When he won the election, we were fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your political point of view, we were there when he won. So we thought, you know what, let's do this live. So we have there 288 votes and this is quite recently. This was just last week for the TU Academic Expo, and we had some high school students who came over and tested our interpreting booths. We do have it at 2 campuses, here at Rangsit and the other at Thammasat. Most of them were quite blown away by the existence of this machine and the existence of the field. And this is Ajahn Sasi introducing to the students what interpreting and different modes of interpreting.
Tempting the student.
Yeah, tempting the student, luring the students. And these are 2 of my colleagues. Well, this is when they tried it out, one of them. So, then, actually before that, I would like to thank the Department of English and Linguistics, especially the department head and committee members, for this great, thought-provoking opportunity to Romania. I learned a lot from it. So usually any talk would end with a quote, a smart quote, right? And I spent a lot of time coming up with one, and trying to sum up what an interpreter is and what it entails. So that's, I think interpreting changes people's lives. For interpreting to work, we interpreters are to be mostly invisible. However, we become visible when they need us the most. I think that's in my opinion, that's what interpreters are all about. Okay, and it's 2016 because it was yesterday. Well, I think I did finish a bit early, but I am open for discussions from now on.